The Cessna 172 appeared on radar at 14:22 hours, a tiny blip against the vast Pacific canvas that shouldn't have been there. Air traffic control at Nellis watched the aircraft wobble through restricted airspace like a drunk butterfly, its transponder squawking civilian codes in a zone where only military frequencies belonged. The controller's coffee grew cold as he stared at the impossible signature. No flight plan, no radio contact, just a single-engine civilian aircraft dancing through Class A airspace reserved for weapons testing. Major Catalina Phoenix Vasquez was conducting routine patrol exercises 40 miles southwest when the scramble order crackled through her F-16's comm system. Her squadron had been practicing formation flying in the desert heat, the kind of mundane training that felt more like aerial choreography than combat preparation. The sudden urgency in the tower's voice cut through the monotony like a blade. Phoenix, this is Castle Control. Immediate Vector 270, Angels 15. Unknown civilian aircraft in restricted zone Echo 7. Rules of engagement, visual identification, attempt contact, escalate per protocol. Catalina's gloved fingers found the throttle instinctively, muscle memory from 8 years of military flying taking control. Her F-16C Fighting Falcon responded with a throaty roar, afterburner painting orange flames against the crystalline desert sky. Below, the Mojave stretched endlessly, a brown canvas dotted with Joshua trees and military installations that existed on no public maps. The radar contact grew larger on her multifunction display, still maintaining that erratic flight pattern that defied explanation. Civilian pilots didn't just stumble into restricted airspace, not here, not in the most heavily monitored desert in North America. The area surrounding Nellis Air Force Base was sacred ground, protected by layers of electronic surveillance and patrolled by the finest military aviators in the world. Whatever was happening up there, it wasn't accidental. As Phoenix closed the distance, her wingman Lieutenant Marcus Torch Rodriguez pulled into formation beside her. They'd flown together for 2 years, their aircraft moving in perfect synchronization despite the growing tension crackling through their helmet comms. Torch was young, eager, still believing that every contact might be his chance for glory. Phoenix knew better. After Iraq, Afghanistan, and 3 deployments that had cost her more than she cared to remember, she understood that real combat rarely announced itself with sirens and scramble orders. The Cessna materialized through her HUD like a ghost made real, white fuselage catching sunlight, wings steady despite the chaotic radar signature they'd been tracking. Phoenix's breath caught in her throat. The aircraft wasn't flying erratically because of mechanical failure or pilot inexperience. Someone was deliberately executing a pattern she'd seen only once before, in a place and time that haunted her dreams. The recognition hit her like a physical blow, muscle memory and trauma, intertwining in ways that made her hands tremble against the flight controls. Phoenix's F-16 sliced through the desert air at 400 knots, her aircraft's angular silhouette casting shadows across the endless Mojave below. The Cessna held steady in her 12 o'clock position, no longer exhibiting the erratic behavior that had triggered the intercept. From this distance, she could make out details that the radar couldn't capture. A single occupant in the cockpit, hands moving with deliberate precision across controls that should have been unfamiliar to anyone crazy enough to penetrate restricted airspace. Castle Control, Phoenix. Visual contact established with civilian aircraft, type Cessna 172, registration November 74 Delta Mike. Single occupant, no apparent distress signals. Aircraft appears airworthy and under positive control. Her voice remained steady despite the growing knot in her stomach. Military protocol demanded clinical precision, but something about this intercept felt deeply personal. Phoenix Castle Control. Attempt radio contact on guard frequency. If unsuccessful, proceed with visual signals per CONR protocols. Catalina switched to the emergency frequency that all pilots monitored, her thumb finding the transmit button with practiced ease. Civilian aircraft November 74 Delta Mike. This is United States Air Force fighter aircraft on your 6 o'clock position. You are in violation of restricted airspace. Acknowledge this transmission and follow my lead aircraft to Nellis Air Force Base for immediate landing. Static filled her headset. The Cessna continued its steady flight path, neither acknowledging her transmission nor showing any sign of compliance. Phoenix pulled alongside the smaller aircraft, close enough to see through the cockpit windows. The pilot wore a faded baseball cap and civilian clothes, his profile somehow familiar despite the distance and relative motion between their aircraft. When he turned toward her F-16, their eyes met across the void of sky and military protocol. The man's face was weathered by sun and time, with the kind of deep lines that came from squinting into bright horizons. But it was his hands that made Phoenix's blood run cold, the way they gripped the yoke, the deliberate precision of his control inputs, the unconscious confidence that marked someone who had spent years learning to fly in conditions where mistakes meant death. This wasn't a lost civilian who had wandered into restricted airspace by accident. Torch Phoenix, I need you to maintain overwatch position. Something's not right here. Her wingman's F-16 held steady in combat spread formation, far enough away to avoid collision but close enough to provide immediate support if the situation deteriorated. The Cessna pilot reached up and adjusted something on his instrument panel, a movement so familiar that Phoenix felt her chest tighten with recognition. She'd seen that exact gesture before, performed by hands she'd once known as well as her own. The realization struck her like lightning. This wasn't just any civilian pilot. This was someone from her past, someone who had taught her that particular combination of confidence and precision that had kept her alive through 3 combat deployments. Her father's voice echoed through memory. Flying isn't about the aircraft, kit. It's about reading the sky, understanding what it's trying to tell you. He'd used her childhood nickname, the one that only family knew back when she was just a girl dreaming of wings and freedom instead of Major Catalina Vasquez, call sign Phoenix, with 8 years of military service and 2 air medals hanging in her quarters. The Cessna's pilot turned toward her again, and this time he raised his hand in a gesture that made her heart stop. Not a wave, not a salute, but something much more specific, 3 fingers extended, thumb and pinky folded under. The old signal they'd used during her childhood flying lessons, when hand signals across the cockpit of his Piper Cherokee had been their private language before she was old enough for radio procedures. Phoenix, Castle Control. Civilian aircraft remains non-responsive to radio contact. Proceed with intercept procedures. You are authorized to use flares for attention-getting if necessary. Catalina's voice caught in her throat as she keyed the microphone. Castle Control, Phoenix. Request. Request permission to attempt alternate communication methods before escalation. The words felt strange in her mouth, military protocol warring with recognition that cut deeper than procedure or training. Below them, the desert landscape scrolled past at 300 miles per hour, but time seemed suspended between 2 aircraft that should have been enemies but somehow weren't. The tactical situation demanded immediate action according to every manual she'd memorized, every briefing she'd attended, every rule of engagement drilled into her consciousness through years of military conditioning. But the man in that Cessna wasn't just violating restricted airspace. He was reaching across 15 years of silence and estrangement with a hand signal that meant everything and nothing, depending on whether she was Major Vasquez or still just Kit, the little girl who had learned to love the sky in the passenger seat of a Cherokee. Torch's voice crackled through the comm system, cutting through her internal struggle. Phoenix, the civilian is beginning a left turn, heading approximately 280. Should I move to intercept position? His F-16 was already shifting, responding to the Cessna's movement with the fluid precision of a predator tracking prey. The younger pilot's eagerness radiated through the radio, his first real intercept mission unfolding exactly as the training manuals had promised. But Phoenix recognized the turn. It wasn't evasive maneuvering or panic. It was a specific heading that led to a particular piece of desert that existed in no flight manual or navigation chart. Her father had shown her that place when she was 16, a natural landing strip hidden between ridges where he'd practiced emergency procedures during his own military service decades earlier. The old man was trying to tell her something, using a language they'd developed when the world was simpler, and flying meant freedom instead of intercept missions and rules of engagement. Negative torch. Maintain current position. I'm going to try something. She matched the Cessna's turn, her F-16's advanced flight controls making the maneuver effortless despite the massive difference in performance between the two aircraft. The desert floor tilted beneath them as they banked together, two aircraft connected by shared motion and memories that defied radio frequencies and military protocol. Phoenix found herself studying the Cessna's flight characteristics with professional interest despite the emotional chaos in her mind. The aircraft was well maintained, its control surfaces responding smoothly to pilot input without the sluggish behavior that marked neglect or mechanical problems. Someone had invested serious time and money in keeping the old trainer airworthy, which meant this wasn't a desperate flight or mechanical emergency. This was deliberate, planned, purposeful, which made it infinitely more dangerous from a military perspective. Castle Control, Phoenix. Civilian aircraft is complying with course changes. Currently heading 280 at 90 knots, altitude 8,500. Request instructions for further intercept procedures. She kept her voice professionally neutral while her mind raced through possibilities. Military doctrine provided clear guidelines for dealing with unresponsive civilian aircraft in restricted airspace, but none of those guidelines accounted for personal history or family complications. The radio crackled with static before Castle Control responded. Phoenix, be advised we have additional contacts scrambling from Nellies. F-22 element will be on station in 12 minutes. Maintain visual contact with civilian aircraft and attempt to establish communication. Use all available means to determine pilot intentions and direct aircraft to authorized landing facility. Additional fighters meant the situation was escalating beyond routine intercept procedures. F-22 Raptors carried more than just visual intimidation. They represented the full weight of American air superiority, technology and firepower that could eliminate threats with surgical precision. Phoenix felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling across her shoulders, the burden of decisions that could spiral beyond control if she chose wrong. The man in the Cessna had maybe 12 minutes before military pressure increased exponentially. She pulled her F-16 closer to the civilian aircraft, near enough to see individual rivets and the way sunlight reflected off the polished propeller hub. The pilot turned toward her again, and this time his expression was serious, almost desperate. He pointed downward, then tapped his temple with one finger before repeating the three-finger signal that had started this entire recognition sequence. The gesture was unmistakable. Remember what I taught you about reading the sky, about understanding what lies beneath the surface of things. Phoenix understood. Her father wasn't just violating restricted airspace randomly. He was trying to reach something specific, some place or person or memory that required breaking every rule of civilian aviation. The old emergency landing strip he'd shown her years ago lay 15 miles ahead, hidden in a desert valley that existed outside normal flight patterns and radar coverage. If he could reach that place, whatever message he was trying to deliver might finally make sense. The Cessna's engine note changed subtly, a shift in propeller pitch that indicated the pilot was adjusting power settings for a specific purpose. Phoenix's trained ear caught the modification immediately. Her father was preparing for a descent, planning to take the aircraft down to terrain-following altitudes where radar coverage became unreliable and visual tracking required constant attention. Military interceptors could follow him down, But at low altitude, the performance advantage of her F-16 became a liability rather than an asset. Phoenix, this is Torch. I'm reading power reduction on the civilian aircraft. Looks like he's setting up for descent. Should I report to Castle Control? The younger pilot's voice carried undertones of excitement mixed with professional concern. This was developing into exactly the kind of tactical scenario they'd practiced in training, an unresponsive civilian aircraft exhibiting suspicious flight behavior in restricted airspace. But Phoenix knew this wasn't training, and whatever was happening couldn't be resolved through standard intercept procedures. Her father had spent 30 years flying everything from crop dusters to corporate jets, accumulating knowledge about desert aviation that no military manual could capture. If he wanted to disappear into the terrain, he possessed both the skill and local knowledge to make intercept operations exponentially more complicated. Castle Control, Phoenix. Civilian aircraft is beginning descent. Request permission to escort at low altitude. Her words carried careful emphasis, escort rather than intercept, suggesting cooperation rather than enforcement. The distinction might buy precious time before the F-22s arrived with their advanced sensors and more aggressive rules of engagement. Phoenix, Castle Control. Negative on low-altitude escort. Maintain current altitude and visual contact. Additional assets will handle terrain following if civilian aircraft fails to comply with landing instructions. The controller's voice had shifted into the clipped tones of elevated threat assessment, where human judgment gave way to procedural responses designed for maximum security. The Cessna continued its descent, dropping toward the desert floor with the steady precision of a pilot who knew exactly where he was going. Phoenix found herself caught between military duty and personal recognition, between the oath she'd sworn to protect American airspace and the loyalty she owed to the man who had first shown her the magic of flight. Below them, the Mojave landscape grew larger and more detailed, individual rocks and cacti becoming visible, as altitude decreased toward the realm where flying became intimate and dangerous. Phoenix's decision crystallized with the clarity that came from years of combat experience. Military protocol demanded she maintain altitude and report the civilian aircraft's noncompliance, allowing more advanced fighters to handle low-altitude intercept operations. But her father was sending a message that transcended normal communication channels, reaching across 15 years of silence with aviation skills that predated modern military doctrine. If she wanted to understand what he was trying to tell her, she would have to follow him down into the desert where rules became fluid, and survival depended on reading the sky with instincts older than radar and missiles. Torch, Phoenix. I'm going to maintain visual contact with the civilian aircraft. Request you report our status to Castle Control and maintain overwatch position. Her F-16 began a shallow descent, following the Cessna toward terrain that would challenge every system on her advanced fighter aircraft. Phoenix, I don't think that's a good idea. The F-22s will be here soon, and they have better low-altitude tracking systems. Maybe we should just maintain current altitude and let them handle the intercept. Torch's concern was tactically sound and procedurally correct, reflecting training that emphasized overwhelming technological advantage over individual pilot judgment. But Phoenix was already committed to the descent, her aircraft following the Cessna down toward the desert floor where flying became a conversation between pilot and landscape rather than pilot and technology. Torch, sometimes you have to read between the lines. This civilian isn't running from us. He's trying to tell us something. I need to find out what that is before the heavy cavalry arrives. The Cessna leveled off at 500 feet above ground level, skimming across the desert landscape with the casual confidence of a pilot who had flown this terrain for decades. Phoenix maintained position slightly above and behind, her F-16's advanced flight controls automatically compensating for the turbulent air that rose from sun-heated rocks and sand. At this altitude, flying became visceral rather than technological. requiring constant attention to terrain features and atmospheric conditions that could kill an inattentive pilot in seconds. Her father's voice echoed through memory again. "The desert teaches different lessons than the sky, Kit. Down here, you learn to read the ground as carefully as the weather." He'd been preparing her for solo flights across the Southwest, teaching survival skills that had seemed like adventure rather than necessity. Now, following his Cessna through terrain that could tear apart an F-16 with one navigation error, Phoenix understood that those lessons had been preparation for something much more serious than teenage adventure flying. Castle Control, Phoenix. Civilian aircraft has leveled at 500 feet AGL, heading 285, maintaining visual contact. Aircraft appears to be following specific navigation route rather than random flight path. She hoped the professional assessment would buy additional time before the situation escalated beyond her ability to control. Phoenix, Castle Control. F-22 Element is now 7 minutes out. Maintain current position and prepare to hand off intercept responsibilities. Civilian aircraft is approaching restricted zone Echo 7 Alpha, which contains active weapons testing ranges. Any further penetration will trigger automatic defensive measures. The warning sent ice through Phoenix's veins. Zone Echo 7 Alpha housed experimental weapon systems and unmanned defense networks that responded to intrusion with lethal force. Military personnel knew to avoid the area even during routine training exercises, and civilian aircraft were prohibited by federal law backed up by automated surface-to-air missile systems. If her father continued on his current heading, he would trigger defenses that operated without human oversight or mercy. The Cessna showed no signs of course correction, maintaining its steady flight path toward a perimeter that existed as invisible death in the desert air. Phoenix realized with growing horror that her father either didn't know about the automated defenses or didn't care about the consequences of penetrating them. Either possibility suggested a level of desperation that transformed this intercept from routine enforcement into potential tragedy. Civilian aircraft, November 7-4 Delta Mike. This is United States Air Force fighter aircraft on emergency frequency. You are approaching restricted airspace protected by active defense systems. Immediate course correction is required to avoid engagement by automated systems. Acknowledge this transmission and turn to heading 090 immediately. Her voice carried more urgency than military protocol typically allowed, but desperate situations demanded human emotion over procedural correctness. The Cessna's pilot turned toward her F-16 again, and this time his expression was grim with determination rather than desperate communication. He held up 4 fingers, then pointed ahead toward the invisible boundary that marked the beginning of the weapon's testing range. 4 minutes. Whatever he was trying to reach lay 4 minutes ahead, beyond defenses that would interpret his Cessna as a hostile target requiring immediate elimination. Phoenix understood with crystalline clarity that her father was on a suicide mission disguised as a navigation error. The weapon's testing range contained something he needed to reach more than he needed to survive, some objective worth penetrating automated defenses that had been designed to stop military-grade threats. The old man had taught her to read the sky, but he'd never explained how to read the human heart when desperation overruled survival instincts. Her F-16's warning systems began detecting the electronic signatures that marked the perimeter of restricted zone Echo 7 Alpha. Radar illumination, target acquisition systems, and missile guidance networks painted the desert ahead with invisible energy that spelled death for unauthorized aircraft. Phoenix had trained extensively with these systems, understanding their capabilities and limitations with professional respect. They were designed to eliminate threats without hesitation, human oversight, or second chances. Castle Control, Phoenix. Civilian aircraft is approaching weapons range perimeter. Request immediate authorization to use non-lethal force to divert aircraft from restricted zone. Her words carried desperate urgency masked as professional assessment. Military doctrine provided specific guidance for protecting civilian aircraft from their own mistakes, but only when those aircraft showed willingness to be saved. Phoenix Castle Control. Negative on force authorization. F-22 element will handle perimeter security. Your orders are to maintain visual contact and report civilian aircraft position. Do not, repeat, do not attempt physical intervention with civilian aircraft. The controller's response reflected policy designed to prevent escalation and minimize friendly fire incidents, but it condemned her father to face automated defenses with no protection except hope and aluminum skin. The Cessna continued its approach toward the invisible death that waited beyond the next ridge. Phoenix found herself flying alongside a man who had taught her everything about aviation, except how to choose duty over family when the two conflicted beyond reconciliation. Below them, the desert landscape held secrets that predated military installations and weapons testing, places where her father had shown her the beauty of flight before it became her profession and burden. 2 minutes from the perimeter, the Cessna began a gentle climbing turn that broke Phoenix's heart with its familiar precision. Her father was executing the same maneuver he taught her for emergency landing approaches, a spiral descent that would bring him down exactly where he intended despite obstacles that should have made success impossible. But instead of landing, he was climbing toward the defense perimeter with the methodical precision of a pilot who had calculated odds and accepted consequences. "Dad, don't do this." The words escaped before she could stop them, transmitted on the emergency frequency where every controller and pilot within 200 miles could hear her personal plea bleeding through military professionalism. She'd broken the most fundamental rule of radio communication: never let emotion compromise operational security. But watching her father approach certain death made protocol seem irrelevant. The Cessna's pilot turned toward her one final time, and his smile carried 15 years of regret mixed with the satisfaction of a man who had found his daughter again, even under circumstances that prohibited reunion. He raised his hand in the three-finger signal that had started their communication, then pointed ahead toward the weapon's range with the determination of someone who had already made peace with his choice. Phoenix realized that her father wasn't trying to reach something in the weapon's testing range. He was trying to reach her, using the only language they still shared across years of silence and misunderstanding. The intercept hadn't been about violation of restricted airspace or military security. It had been about a father's last attempt to communicate with a daughter who had chosen duty over family so completely that only desperate measures could bridge the gap between their worlds. The automated defense systems activated with mechanical precision as the Cessna crossed the invisible perimeter that marked the beginning of Restricted Zone Echo 7 Alpha. Phoenix watched her tactical display light up with missile launches and radar locks, technology designed to eliminate threats before human operators could intervene or hesitate. Her father's aircraft became a target designation rather than a living person, reduced to coordinates and velocity vectors that mathematical algorithms would optimize for destruction. But the Cessna didn't explode in the fireball that Phoenix expected. Instead, it continued flying straight and level, as if the surface-to-air missiles had somehow missed their target or malfunctioned catastrophically. Phoenix stared at her displays in confusion, watching missile tracks that should have intersected with her father's aircraft, but somehow didn't, like watching magic happen in the sterile environment of military technology. Castle Control, Phoenix. Civilian aircraft has penetrated the perimeter, but defensive systems appear to be malfunctioning. No impacts observed, aircraft still under positive control and continuing on original heading. Her report reflected disbelief more than professional assessment, describing events that contradicted everything she understood about automated defense networks. Phoenix Castle Control. Confirm civilian aircraft status. Repeat, confirm civilian aircraft is still airborne and under positive control. The controller's voice carried the same confusion that filled Phoenix's mind, describing a situation that shouldn't have been possible given the lethal efficiency of the weapons systems protecting the range. The Cessna banked into a left turn, following a specific ground track that Phoenix suddenly recognized from childhood memories. Her father was flying the route they'd used during her early navigation training, following landmarks that existed in no official chart, but were burned into her memory from countless hours of practice flights. He was leading her toward the emergency landing strip he'd shown her years ago, the hidden valley where he'd taught her that flying was about more than following rules and procedures. Phoenix followed the turn despite orders to maintain position and wait for F-22 backup, her F-16 responding to control inputs that felt automatic despite the chaos surrounding the intercept mission. Below them, the desert landscape revealed secrets that predated military installations, ancient lake beds and natural clearings that early aviators had used as emergency fields long before the government claimed this territory for weapons testing and classified experiments. The hidden valley appeared ahead exactly as Phoenix remembered it, a natural depression between ridges that provided wind protection and enough flat ground for aircraft operations. Her father's Cessna lined up for final approach with the casual precision of a pilot returning home after a long journey. The wheels touched down on hard-packed earth that had supported aircraft for decades, raising a small cloud of dust that marked successful completion of a flight that should have ended in catastrophic destruction. Phoenix overflew the valley at 500 feet, watching her father taxi the Cessna toward a grove of Joshua trees that provided shade and concealment from overhead observation. The landing strip looked exactly as she remembered it from teenage adventures, when flying had meant freedom and discovery rather than intercept missions and rules of engagement. Her father had brought her here to teach lessons that no military academy could provide: how to read the desert, how to find safety in places that appeared on no chart, how to trust instincts that went deeper than technology and procedure. Castle Control, Phoenix. Civilian aircraft has landed at an unauthorized strip in the weapons testing range. Pilot appears to be securing aircraft and I think he's trying to signal me to land. Her voice carried confusion and growing understanding, describing a situation that had moved beyond standard intercept procedures into territory that no training manual had ever covered. Next, Castle Control. Negative on landing. F-22 element is 3 minutes out. Maintain overwatch position and report any additional activity. Ground security teams are being dispatched to investigate civilian aircraft and pilot. The controller's response reflected policy designed for hostile intrusions rather than family reunions, but Phoenix understood that ground teams would find only questions that led to more questions in the hidden valley her father had chosen for their reunion. The Cessna's pilot climbed out of his aircraft and stood in the shade of the Joshua trees, looking up at Phoenix's F-16 with an expression she couldn't see but could feel across the distance that separated them. He was waiting for her to make a choice between military duty and personal understanding, between the oath she'd sworn to protect American airspace and the loyalty she owed to the man who had first shown her the magic of flight. Phoenix banked into a climbing turn that would take her F-16 back to safe altitude and professional distance, but her eyes remained locked on the figure standing beside the Cessna in the hidden valley below. Her father had risked everything to reach this place, penetrating defenses that should have killed him and violating laws that carried decades of imprisonment. The message he was trying to send transcended normal communication channels, reaching across years of silence with aviation skills and desperate courage. Torch Phoenix. I'm going to make a low pass over the landing site to assess the situation. Maintain your current position and report our status to Castle Control. Her words reflected decisions that felt inevitable despite their violation of direct orders, choosing understanding over procedure in a situation where military doctrine provided no guidance for family complications. Phoenix, I don't think that's a good idea. The F-22s will be here soon, and they're going to want clear airspace for their own assessment. Maybe we should just maintain altitude and let them handle ground reconnaissance. Torch's concern was tactically sound, but Phoenix was already committed to descent toward the valley where her father waited with answers to questions she'd carried for 15 years. The F-16 dropped toward the desert floor again, following a flight path that took her directly over the hidden landing strip, where childhood memories waited alongside current reality. Her father stood motionless beside his aircraft, watching her approach with the patient dignity of a man who had accepted whatever consequences his choices might bring. The distance between them collapsed to hundreds of feet, then dozens, as Phoenix's fighter aircraft screamed overhead at 300 knots. In the brief instant of closest approach, Phoenix saw her father's face clearly for the first time in 15 years. Age had carved deeper lines around his eyes, and gray had replaced the brown hair she remembered, but his expression carried the same mixture of pride and sadness that had marked their last conversation before she'd left for the Air Force Academy. He raised his hand in a final salute, not the casual three-finger signal they'd used for communication, but the formal gesture of respect between aviators who understood that some flights ended in separation rather than reunion. Phoenix pulled the F-16 into a climbing turn that carried her away from the valley and back, toward the professional distance that military duty required. Behind her, ground security teams would soon arrive to arrest a man whose only crime had been trying to reach a daughter who had chosen duty over family so completely that desperate measures became the only remaining communication channel. The hidden landing strip would be classified and forgotten, another secret buried in the desert where no official records could acknowledge its existence or importance. Castle Control, Phoenix. I have completed reconnaissance of the unauthorized landing site. Civilian aircraft and pilot are secured on the ground awaiting arrival of security teams. No additional threats or complications observed. Her report reflected professional assessment rather than personal recognition, describing events in language that preserved operational security while concealing emotional truth. The F-22 Raptors appeared on her radar as she climbed back to assigned altitude, their advanced stealth systems revealing themselves only when they chose to be seen. Phoenix felt a mixture of relief and loss as the sophisticated fighters took over responsibility for the intercept mission, their technology and firepower representing the full weight of American air superiority, applied to a situation that had never required military force. Phoenix, Castle Control. F-22 Element is now on station. You are cleared to return to base for debriefing. Well done on a challenging intercept mission. The controller's praise felt hollow despite its professional sincerity, recognizing tactical success while ignoring the human cost of duty performed without compromise or mercy. Phoenix turned her F-16 toward Nellis Air Force Base, leaving behind the desert valley where her father waited under guard for transportation to federal custody and charges that would end his freedom permanently. The intercept mission had been completed according to procedure and regulation, protecting American airspace from intrusion by an unauthorized civilian aircraft. But the real communication had happened between two pilots who shared a language older than military protocol, understanding each other across distances that measured more than miles or altitude. The flight back to base passed in mechanical routine, her F-16 covering familiar ground at altitudes that provided safety and distance from the complications that waited in hidden valleys below. Phoenix found herself thinking about the three-finger signal her father had used for communication, remembering childhood flying lessons when hand signals across the cockpit had been their private language before she was old enough for radio procedures. The memory carried weight that transcended nostalgia, representing connections that survived even when duty demanded their sacrifice. Nellis Air Force Base appeared ahead, its runways and hangars representing order and purpose in a world where military aviation served clear objectives backed by unlimited resources and advanced technology. Phoenix configured her F-16 for landing approach, following procedures that had become automatic through years of practice and repetition. But part of her mind remained in the desert valley, where her father waited beside a Cessna that had carried messages too complex for radio transmission or official understanding. The F-16 touched down on runway 21 with the gentle precision that marked professional competence, speed brakes and thrust reversers, bringing 40,000 pounds of fighter aircraft to taxi speed without drama or excitement. Phoenix followed ground control instructions toward the ramp where maintenance crews waited to service aircraft and pilots waited to debrief missions that rarely involved family complications or personal recognition across enemy lines. Phoenix, welcome back. Tower reports successful completion of intercept mission. Civilian aircraft secured, pilot in custody, no complications or additional threats identified. The ground controller's summary reduced complex human drama to simple tactical assessment, focusing on military objectives achieved rather than personal costs incurred. Phoenix shut down her F-16 systems with the methodical precision that military training demanded, each switch and procedure performed in sequence that had been drilled into automatic response. But her mind remained divided between professional satisfaction and personal loss, recognizing duty accomplished while mourning connections that military service had required her to sacrifice. The hidden valley in the desert held secrets that would never appear in official reports, stories of fathers and daughters who had chosen different forms of service to their country. The debriefing session took place in a sterile conference room where fluorescent lights eliminated shadows and official forms, reduced human complexity to checkbox responses and tactical assessment. Phoenix answered questions about the intercept mission with professional accuracy, describing events in language that preserved operational security while concealing emotional truth. Her responses satisfied military requirements while protecting personal recognitions that had no place in official documentation. Major Vasquez, your handling of this intercept was exemplary. The civilian pilot showed unusual skill and knowledge of restricted airspace, but your persistence in maintaining visual contact prevented him from reaching more sensitive areas of the weapon's testing range. The debriefing officer's praise reflected standard assessment criteria applied to a situation that had challenged every assumption about routine intercept missions. Phoenix accepted the commendation with appropriate professional response, understanding that her tactical performance had indeed prevented escalation while protecting classified installations from unauthorized observation. But the real success had been recognizing her father's message before military force eliminated all possibility of communication or understanding. The three-finger signal had bridged 15 years of silence, carrying meaning that survived even when reunion became impossible. Sir, I do have one question about the civilian pilot's background. Has there been any determination of his identity or motivation for penetrating restricted airspace? Phoenix's inquiry reflected professional interest rather than personal curiosity, seeking information that might explain the unusual flying skills and specific knowledge the intercept had revealed. That information is classified pending completion of the investigation. However, I can tell you that the pilot appears to have extensive aviation experience and detailed knowledge of this geographic area. Security teams are conducting interviews to determine how he acquired information about restricted flight routes and emergency landing sites. The officer's response contained enough detail to confirm Phoenix's recognition, while maintaining operational security around ongoing investigations. The debriefing concluded with standard procedures for mission completion and post-flight aircraft inspection, reducing extraordinary human drama to routine administrative requirements. Phoenix signed documents that classified her report and restricted discussion of mission details, understanding that official silence would protect military interests while burying personal truths in filing systems that preserved secrets rather than memories or understanding. Walking across the flight line toward her quarters, Phoenix found herself looking up at the desert sky where her father's Cessna had appeared like a ghost from her past, carrying messages that transcended normal communication channels. The intercept mission had been completed successfully according to every measure that mattered to military assessment. But the real communication had happened between two pilots who shared a language older than procedure and regulation. Her quarters provided familiar refuge from the complexity of duty performed under impossible circumstances. Walls decorated with awards and photographs that marked professional achievement rather than personal connection. Phoenix sat at her desk and began writing a letter that would never be sent, words that tried to capture recognition and understanding that had happened across the cockpit of an F-16 at 300 feet above the desert floor. "Dad," she wrote, "I saw your signal. I understood what you were trying to tell me about reading the sky and finding truth beneath the surface of things. I'm sorry that duty prevented me from landing in that valley where you taught me to fly, but I want you to know that those lessons have kept me alive through 3 combat deployments and 8 years of military service. You were right about flying being more than following rules and procedures. It's about reading the sky with instincts that go deeper than technology and training." The letter continued for several pages, trying to bridge 15 years of silence with words that could never be delivered to a man awaiting federal charges for violating restricted airspace. Phoenix wrote about combat missions where her father's lessons had provided survival skills that no military academy could teach, about moments when reading the sky had meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure, about recognition that transcended radio frequencies and official communication channels. Finally, she folded the letter and placed it in her personal file alongside photographs and awards that marked milestones in a military career, built on foundations that her father had provided before duty demanded their sacrifice. The words would remain,